When Clara Brennan was put up for auction to pay her father's debts, the crowd of miners and ranchers saw only damaged goods, a refined woman with soft hands who'd never survived frontier life. But one mysterious rancher saw something different in her desperate eyes, bidding his entire life savings to buy her freedom. What secret was he willing to risk everything to protect? Blood dripped from Clara's split lip onto the dusty wooden platform where she crouched like a trapped animal. The Nevada Territory sun blazed overhead in September 1867, but she felt cold as winter ice. Around her, rough men with dirty faces and cruel eyes gathered like buzzards around fresh kill. "Look at her shake," laughed a fat man with tobacco stains on his yellow teeth. "City girl ain't used to our ways out here." Clara pulled her torn dress tighter around her shoulders. The fabric barely covered her bruised arms and legs. 3 days ago, she had been eating fancy dinners in a big house. Now she sat on an auction block, like a piece of furniture, waiting to be sold. The auctioneer, a thin man named Hartwell, wiped sweat from his forehead. He looked as uncomfortable as Clara felt. "Gentlemen, we need to settle the debt of $300. This young lady comes with papers showing she can read and write." "What good's reading gonna do me?" shouted a bearded miner. "I need someone who can cook beans and mend clothes." Clara's stomach twisted with fear. She had never cooked beans in her life. Her soft hands had never washed clothes or cleaned floors. Back in Boston, servants did all the hard work while she played piano and painted flowers. A group of cowboys on horseback watched from the edge of the crowd. Their leader, a man with a gold tooth, smiled in a way that made Clara want to hide. She had heard whispers about men like him, men who bought women for reasons that made decent people look away. The wind picked up, blowing dust into everyone's eyes. Clara tasted dirt on her lips. Everything here was dirty, the buildings, the people, even the air. She wondered if she would ever be clean again. "My father was a good man," she whispered to herself, trying to remember his kind face. But Papa was dead now, killed in a wagon accident just outside town. His gambling debts had become her burden to carry. An old woman in a faded blue dress pushed through the crowd. Her gray hair was pulled back tight, and her face looked like leather left too long in the sun. "Poor child," she muttered. "This ain't right, selling people like cattle." But most of the crowd didn't share her feelings. They saw only another mouth to feed, another problem to solve. In this harsh land where water was scarce and winter killed the weak, kindness was a luxury few could afford. Clara remembered the stagecoach ride west with her father. He had promised her a new life, far from the scandal that chased them out of Boston. "We'll find gold," he had said. "We'll be rich again." Instead, he found only death on a dusty road, leaving her alone with nothing but debts and shame. The sun climbed higher, making the wooden platform burn hot under Clara's bare feet. Her shoes had been taken to pay for her father's burial. Everything valuable had been sold: her mother's jewelry, her father's gold watch, even her warm coat. "She's too skinny," complained a ranch hand. "Look at those arms. Couldn't lift a water bucket if her life depended on it." Clara's cheeks burned with shame. It was true. Her arms were thin and weak. Her hands had never held anything heavier than a book. How could she survive in a place where strength meant the difference between life and death? A vulture circled overhead, its shadow crossing the platform like a bad omen. Clara shivered despite the heat. She felt like that vulture was waiting for her to die. "What happened to her face?" asked a young cowboy, pointing at Clara's bruised cheek. Hartwell shuffled his papers nervously. "There was some trouble last night. Nothing serious." But Clara remembered every detail of that trouble. Men had come to her father's rented room after the funeral. They wanted their money, and when she couldn't pay, they decided to take it out in other ways. Only the sheriff's arrival had saved her from worse. The crowd grew restless in the heat. Horses stamped their feet and switched their tails at flies. Men took off their hats to wipe away sweat. But Clara sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might draw unwanted attention. A small boy pushed through the crowd, staring at Clara with wide eyes. His mother quickly pulled him back. "Don't look, Jimmy. It ain't proper." Clara wanted to tell the boy that she wasn't always like this. Once, she had worn silk dresses and danced at fancy parties. She had studied French and played music that made people cry with joy, but those days felt like a dream now, fading away like morning mist. The church bell in the distance chimed noon. Clara's stomach growled with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and even then it was only stale bread and water. The men holding her father's debts said food cost extra money she didn't have. Time to start the bidding, Hartwell announced, his voice cracking like a boy's. What am I offered for this young woman? She comes with a certificate of good character from her previous employer. The certificate was a lie, but Clara said nothing. What was one more lie in a life that had become nothing but deception? She had lied to get West, lied about her father's debts, and now she would lie to survive. A dust devil spun across the town square, picking up papers and trash. Clara watched it dance between the buildings before disappearing into the desert. She envied its freedom to go wherever the wind took it. The crowd muttered among themselves, but no voices called out with bids. Clara was damaged goods in a market that prized strength and usefulness above all else. Her education meant nothing here. Her gentle upbringing was a weakness, not a virtue. Minutes passed like hours. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Clara felt dizzy from heat and fear. Sweat stung her cut lip, and her throat burned with thirst. She wondered if this was how her story would end, dying of shame on a wooden platform while strangers decided her fate. But somewhere in the crowd, unseen eyes watched her with interest. Someone was making calculations, weighing risks and possibilities. The question was whether those eyes belonged to salvation or something far worse. A man's deep voice cut through the crowd's mumbling like a knife through butter. I'll bid $50. Every head turned toward the back of the gathering. Clara squinted against the sun's glare, trying to see who had spoken. All she could make out was a tall shadow wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The crowd stirred like an anthill kicked by a boot. $50 was real money in Calico Junction, enough to buy a horse or supplies for a month. Men whispered to each other, wondering who would pay so much for a city girl who looked ready to blow away in the next strong wind. Hartwell's face brightened like sunshine after rain. $50? Do I hear 60? 55, called out another voice. This one belonged to Jeremiah Slade, the man with the gold tooth. He sat on his black horse like a king on a throne, smiling in a way that made Clara's skin crawl. She had heard the other women in town whisper about Slade. He owned the Red Rose Saloon, where pretty girls served drinks and did other things that decent people didn't talk about. The girls who worked there had empty eyes and painted faces that couldn't hide their sadness. Clara's hands began to shake. If Slade bought her, she knew what her life would become. She would rather die first, but death wasn't one of her choices today. $75, the first voice said calmly. The crowd turned back toward the shadowy figure. A few men stepped aside, and Clara got her first clear look at her potential buyer. He was older than Slade, maybe 40 years, with sun-weathered skin and steady gray eyes. His clothes were simple but clean, a working man's outfit, not fancy like Slade's velvet vest and silver buttons. Something in his face reminded Clara of her father before the gambling fever took hold. There was kindness there, but also strength. This was a man who had faced hardship and survived it. 100, Slade countered, his smile getting wider. He was enjoying this contest, like a cat playing with a mouse before eating it. The gray-eyed man stepped forward into the sunlight. Clara could see him clearly now, tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work. A scar ran along his left jawline, white against his tanned skin. His horse, a gentle-looking mare, stood patiently behind him. 150, he said without hesitation. A gasp ran through the crowd. That was serious money, more than most men in Calico Junction earned in 3 months. Several people craned their necks to get a better look at this stranger who was willing to pay so much. Slade's smile flickered for the first time. His black horse danced nervously, sensing its rider's sudden tension. 200, he growled, his voice losing its playful tone. Clara felt sick to her stomach. She was watching two men bid over her like she was a prize bull at a county fair. The only difference was that cattle got fed and cared for. She wasn't sure what these men had planned for her. The gray-eyed stranger looked directly at Clara for the first time. Their eyes met across the crowd, and she felt something pass between them. Not desire or ownership, but something softer. Recognition, maybe. Like one lost soul seeing another. 250, he said quietly. The crowd fell silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. $250 could buy land, or cattle, or a business. It was enough money to change a person's life completely. Slade's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the desert. He had expected easy victory, not a real fight. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and several men in the crowd stepped backward. "You making a mistake, stranger," Slade said, his voice low and dangerous. "That girl's got secrets. Dark ones. She ain't worth the trouble she'll bring you." Clara's heart stopped beating for a moment. What did Slade know? Had word somehow traveled west from Boston about her troubles there? She had thought her past was buried. But secrets had a way of rising from the grave, like restless spirits. The gray-eyed man didn't flinch at Slade's threat. If anything, he stood straighter, like a tree bracing against a strong wind. Every person's got secrets, Slade. The question is whether you judge them by their worst day, or give them a chance to prove what they're really worth. His words hit Clara like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had talked about her having worth? For months, she had felt like nothing but a burden to her father, to herself, to the world. This stranger was offering something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. $300, the man said firmly. The full amount of the debt. The crowd exploded in whispers and exclamations. $300 was more money than most of them had seen in one place. It was enough to pay off the mortgage on a small ranch or buy a whole herd of cattle. Hartwell's jaw dropped open like a barn door in a windstorm. He had expected to sell Clara for maybe $20 or $30, enough to pay a small portion of her father's debt and send her on her way with the rest still hanging over her head. This changed everything. Slade's face turned red as fresh blood. His hand gripped his gun handle, and for a moment, Clara thought he might draw on the stranger, right there in front of everyone. But killing a man over an auction bid would bring the law down on him. And even Slade wasn't fool enough to risk that. "You don't know what you're buying," Slade said through gritted teeth. "When you find out the truth about her, don't come crying to me." The gray-eyed man ignored Slade completely. He walked up to Hartwell and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. 300, as agreed. Hartwell took the money with shaking hands. He had never handled so much cash at one time. $300 for the young lady. Going once, going twice. He paused, looking around the crowd for any last-minute bids. Sold. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Clara felt the world spinning around her. In the space of 15 minutes, her entire life had changed direction. She belonged to someone new now, but what kind of someone? Was this stranger her salvation, or just a different kind of trap? The man approached the platform slowly, like he was approaching a frightened animal. When he reached the edge, he extended his hand toward Clara. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. "Name's Ezra McKinnon," he said simply. "I got a small ranch about 5 miles out of town. Could use help with cooking and cleaning if you're willing to work for fair wages." The word willing struck Clara like lightning. When was the last time anyone had asked what she was willing to do? For so long, other people had made all her choices for her. Where to go, what to do, how to live. Now this stranger was offering her something precious, the right to choose. She placed her trembling hand in his steady one and felt herself pulled up from the platform. For the first time in months, Clara was standing on level ground instead of looking up at everyone else. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd's noise. Ezra nodded and draped a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders. The wool was rough but warm, and it covered her torn dress completely. Clara pulled it tight around herself, feeling truly clothed for the first time since her father's death. As they walked toward his horse, Clara caught sight of Slade watching them from across the square. His gold tooth caught the sunlight as he smiled, but there was no humor in it. That smile promised trouble, the kind of trouble that followed people into dark places and waited for them there. But for now, Clara was walking away from the auction block on her own 2 feet. Whatever came next, at least she would face it as a person with choices, not as property to be sold to the highest bidder. The question was, what price would she have to pay for this unexpected freedom? The horse beneath Clara bucked wildly as a rattlesnake coiled in their path, ready to strike. Ezra's strong arm tightened around her waist, keeping her from falling as his mare danced sideways on the narrow mountain trail. "Easy, Daisy," Ezra murmured to his horse, his voice calm despite the danger. The snake's rattle filled the air like angry rain on a tin roof. One bite from those fangs could kill a horse in minutes, leaving them stranded miles from town in the Nevada wilderness. Clara held her breath as Ezra slowly reached for the rifle strapped to his saddle. The movement had to be perfect too fast, and the snake would attack too slow, and it might slither closer to the horse's legs. Sweat beaded on Clara's forehead, despite the cool mountain air. The shot rang out like thunder between the canyon walls. The snake's head disappeared in a puff of dust, and its body writhed once before going still. Daisy snorted and stepped carefully around the dead reptile, her hooves clicking on the rocky trail. "First lesson of ranch life," Ezra said as they continued riding. "Always watch where you're going. This land doesn't forgive careless mistakes." Clara nodded, but her mind was spinning with bigger worries than snakes. What would happen when they reached his ranch? What did Ezra really expect from her? The kindness in his eyes at the auction might have been an act to fool the crowd. Now that they were alone, his true nature could emerge. The trail wound higher into the mountains, leaving the desert heat behind. Pine trees grew thick on the slopes, their green needles a welcome change from the brown dust of Calico Junction. A creek bubbled somewhere nearby, the sound of water making Clara realize how thirsty she was. "How much further?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the dry air. "About 2 miles, Ezra replied. "Ranch sits in a valley between 2 ridges. Good water, decent grazing for cattle. My wife picked the spot when we first came west." Wife? Clara's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. Ezra had never mentioned being married. What kind of woman would allow her husband to buy another female at an auction? Was Clara being brought home as a servant, or something worse? "Your wife won't mind you bringing home a stranger?" Clara asked carefully. Ezra was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he had heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that made her chest ache. "Martha passed on 3 years ago. Fever took her and our daughter both, same week. Been living alone since then." The pain in his words was so deep that Clara felt ashamed for suspecting him of evil intentions. This man had lost everything that mattered to him. Maybe loneliness had driven him to spend his life savings on a stranger from an auction block. The trail leveled out as they entered a green valley, surrounded by tall pine trees. A log cabin sat near a stream, with a barn and several smaller buildings scattered around it. Cattle grazed in a fenced pasture, their red and brown coats shining in the afternoon sun. Chickens pecked in the dirt near the house, and a vegetable garden showed neat rows of late-season plants. It looked like a picture from a storybook, the kind of peaceful home Clara had dreamed about during the long, frightening journey west. But she had learned not to trust first impressions. Beautiful places could hide ugly secrets. Ezra helped her down from the horse with the same gentle care he had shown at the auction. His hands never lingered where they shouldn't, and he stepped back as soon as her feet touched the ground. Whatever his faults might be, he was a gentleman. "House needs a woman's touch," he said, almost apologetically. "Haven't been much good at keeping things clean and organized. Cooking's gotten pretty simple too, mostly beans and salt pork." Clara looked at the cabin with fresh eyes. The windows needed washing, and weeds grew up around the foundation. Clothes hung on a line behind the house, but they looked wrinkled and poorly washed. For a man who paid attention to details like dangerous snakes, Ezra seemed lost when it came to household management. "I should warn you," Clara said, twisting her hands nervously in the woolen blanket. "I'm not very good at housework. Back home, we had servants who did the cooking and cleaning. I can read and write, and I know some French. But I've never cooked a meal or washed clothes." She waited for his disappointment, for the moment when he realized he had wasted his money on damaged goods. Instead, Ezra smiled the first real smile she had seen from him. "French won't help much with cattle, but reading and writing are valuable skills out here. As for the rest, we'll figure it out together. I wasn't born knowing how to ranch either. Had to learn everything the hard way." His acceptance hit Clara like warm sunshine after a long winter. When was the last time someone had been patient with her failures instead of angry about them? Her father had loved her, but even he had grown frustrated with her helplessness during their journey west. Ezra led her to the front door of the cabin, then paused with his hand on the wooden handle. "Before we go inside, I want you to understand something. You're not a slave here, Clara. You're not property. I paid your debt because it seemed like the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean you belong to me. You're free to leave any time you want." Clara stared at him in shock. "Leave? But where would I go? I have no money, no family, no friends." "That's your choice to make," Ezra said simply. "But if you decide to stay, you'll work for fair wages and be treated with respect. I'll provide room and board, and you'll have the same rights as any hired hand. No man will touch you without your permission, not even me." The promise brought tears to Clara's eyes. Freedom was a gift she had never expected to receive. But with freedom came responsibility, and Clara wasn't sure she was strong enough to handle either one. The inside of the cabin was dim and cluttered. Dirty dishes sat on a wooden table, and dust covered every surface. Men's clothes lay in piles on chairs, and the stone fireplace was cold and full of old ashes. It smelled like loneliness and neglect. "Your room's upstairs," Ezra said, pointing to a narrow staircase. "Used to be my daughter Annie's room. I haven't touched it since. Well, since she died. Might need some cleaning, but the bed's still good." Clara climbed the stairs on shaking legs. Each step took her further into this new life, this strange arrangement with a man she barely knew. At the top, a short hallway led to 2 doors. One stood open, revealing a large bedroom with an unmade bed and more scattered clothes. The other door was closed. She pushed it open carefully, not sure what she would find. The room beyond was small but clean, as if someone had been taking special care of it. A narrow bed sat against one wall, covered with a quilt that showed careful stitching. A small dresser held a ceramic water pitcher and bowl, both decorated with painted flowers. Curtains hung at the single window, letting in soft light that made dust motes dance in the air. But what caught Clara's attention was the shelf on the far wall. It held books, real books, with leather covers and gold lettering. More books than she had seen since leaving Boston. Her fingers traced the spines lovingly. Shakespeare, Dickens, even a volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Annie loved to read. Ezra's voice came from behind her. He had followed her upstairs, moving quietly on the wooden floor. Martha taught her letters when she was just 4 years old. Always had her nose in a book. Clara turned to face him, clutching one of the books to her chest. "You kept her room exactly as it was." "Couldn't bear to change it," Ezra admitted. Seemed like erasing her memory somehow. But books are meant to be read, not just looked at. Annie would want someone to enjoy them again. The kindness in his gesture overwhelmed Clara. This man had lost his daughter, but was willing to share her memory with a stranger. What had she done to deserve such generosity? "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the gift he was offering. Ezra nodded and turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "Supper's usually around sunset. Nothing fancy tonight, just leftover stew and biscuits." Tomorrow, we can start figuring out how to make this arrangement work for both of us." After he left, Clara sat on the bed and opened the book of poetry. The pages fell open to a poem about hope being the thing with feathers. She read the words over and over, letting them sink into her heart like water into dry ground. Outside her window, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. Golden light painted the valley in warm colors, and the sound of the creek mixed with cattle lowing in the distance. For the first time since her father's death, Clara felt something that might have been peace. But peace was a fragile thing in the Nevada territory. Even as Clara began to hope for a better future, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Jeremiah Slade had not forgotten his humiliation at the auction, and men like him had long memories when it came to revenge. The question was not whether trouble would come, but when it would arrive and what form it would take. Smoke rose from the McKinnon Ranch like a black finger pointing at the sky, visible for miles across the Nevada Valley. Clara stood at the kitchen window, her hands shaking as she watched orange flames lick at the barn roof where Ezra stored his winter hay. "Fire!" she screamed. But Ezra was already running from the pasture where he had been mending fence. His boots pounded across the yard as he grabbed buckets and headed for the stream. The cattle milled nervously in their pen, sensing danger in the air. Clara had never fought a fire before, but she knew what losing the barn would mean. Without hay for winter, the cattle would starve. Without cattle, the ranch would fail. Without the ranch, she would be homeless again, assuming they both survived the next hour. She grabbed the largest pot from the kitchen and ran toward the stream. The water was ice cold from mountain snow, making her hands ache as she filled the heavy pot. By the time she reached the barn, Ezra had already organized a bucket line with 3 of his neighboring ranchers who had seen the smoke. "Over here!" shouted Tom Bradley, a grizzled old cowboy who owned the spread to the north. "Fire's spreading to the hayloft." Clara threw her pot of water at the flames, but it seemed as useless as spitting at a hurricane. The fire roared like a living thing, hungry and angry and growing stronger with every second. Heat battered her face until she could barely keep her eyes open. "The wind's picking up," Ezra yelled over the noise. "If it reaches the house, we'll lose everything." For 2 hours they fought the blaze, passing buckets until their arms screamed with pain. Clara's dress was soaked with water and sweat, and her hair had come loose from its pins. Smoke filled her lungs, making her cough until her chest ached. Just when it seemed the fire might win, the wind shifted direction. The flames turned back on themselves, and the bucket brigade finally began to make progress. By sunset, only smoking ruins remained. Where the barn had stood that morning, Clara collapsed on the ground next to the stream, too exhausted to stand. Her hands were blistered from the hot bucket handles, and her face felt sunburned from the heat. But they had saved the house and most of the animals. Ezra sat down beside her, his shirt torn and his face black with soot. "You did good today," he said simply. "A lot of women would have run inside and hidden." "I thought about it," Clara admitted. "But this is my home now, too. I couldn't just watch it burn." The word home surprised her. When had she started thinking of the ranch that way? 3 weeks ago, she had been ready to run at the first sign of trouble. Now she was willing to fight fires to protect it. Tom Bradley walked over, slapping ash from his hat. "Mighty strange how that fire started," he said, looking meaningfully at Ezra. "No lightning today, and you're too careful to leave hot coals lying around. Someone set this fire on purpose." Clara's blood turned to ice water. Who would do such a thing? "Same kind of man who'd burn out a neighbor for spite," Tom replied. "Or because he didn't get what he wanted at an auction." Ezra's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara could see him thinking, putting pieces together in his mind. The fire had started in the hayloft, far from any natural cause. Someone had climbed up there with matches or a torch. Someone who wanted to hurt Ezra McKinnon specifically. "Slade," Clara whispered. "Can't prove it," Ezra said. "But I'd bet my last dollar you're right." That night, Clara lay awake, listening to every sound outside her window. Every hoot of an owl, every rustle of wind in the trees, made her wonder if danger was creeping closer. Slade had shown what he was willing to do when crossed. What would he try next? The answer came 3 days later, when she rode into town with Ezra to buy supplies for rebuilding the barn. Word had spread about the fire, and people stared at them with a mixture of sympathy and fear. Everyone knew Slade's reputation, and nobody wanted to be his next target. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Patterson, served them quietly, but kept glancing toward the window. Finally, he leaned across the counter and spoke in a low voice. "Slade's been asking questions about your lady friend," he told Ezra. "Wants to know where she came from, what brought her west. Offered good money for information." Clara felt sick to her stomach. She had hoped her past was buried in Boston, but Slade was digging it up like a dog looking for bones. What would happen if he discovered the truth about Charles Whitman and the embezzlement charges? "What kind of questions?" Ezra asked. "About her family, her background, whether she's running from the law." Patterson's eyes flicked to Clara nervously. "I told him I didn't know nothing, but he's got other ways of finding things out." As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Clara noticed more stares than usual from people on the street. Some looked curious, others suspicious. A few women crossed to the other side of the road rather than walk past her. Whatever Slade was spreading, it was working. "Maybe I should leave," Clara said as they drove out of town. "If I'm not here, Slade won't have any reason to bother you." Ezra's hands tightened on the reins. Running away won't solve anything. Men like Slade feed on fear. Show them you're scared, and they'll chase you to the ends of the earth. But what if he finds out about Boston? What if he learns about the charges against me? "Then we'll deal with it when it happens," Ezra said firmly. "I don't care what you did or didn't do back east. What matters is who you are now." His loyalty amazed Clara, but it also frightened her. How could she tell him that her troubles in Boston might follow them both to prison? How could she explain that she was wanted for crimes she didn't commit, accused by a man who was the real thief? That evening, as they worked together to clear debris from the burned barn, Clara made a decision. Ezra deserved to know the truth, even if it meant losing the only home she had found since her father's death. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, setting down her shovel. Before she could continue, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted her words. 3 riders approached the ranch, silhouetted against the sunset. Even from a distance, Clara could see the gleam of gold teeth in the lead rider's smile. Jeremiah Slade had come calling, and this time he wasn't alone. "Get in the house," Ezra said quietly, his hand moving toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. But Clara didn't move. She had run from confrontation in Boston, run from scandal and shame, and the consequences of speaking truth to power. Tonight, she would stand her ground, even if it destroyed her. The riders drew closer, and Clara could see that Slade's companions were the kind of men who settled disputes with bullets rather than words. Whatever Slade had discovered about her past, he was confident enough to bring muscle to back up his threats. "Evening, McKinnon," Slade called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Heard you had some trouble with a fire. Terrible shame about your barn." Ezra's knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. "What do you want, Slade?" "Just to have a friendly conversation with your houseguest," Slade replied, his eyes fixed on Clara. "See, I've been doing some investigating, and I found out some very interesting things about Miss Clara Brennan. Or should I say, Miss Rebecca Morrison. Or maybe Miss Elizabeth Hayes. She's got more names than a traveling salesman." Clara's heart stopped beating. Slade had been busy during the past 3 weeks, and his efforts had paid off. Her carefully constructed new identity was crumbling like a house built on sand. "Turns out our refined young lady is wanted back east for embezzlement," Slade continued, savoring each word like candy. $5,000 stolen from her employer, according to the wanted posters. That's a hanging offense in some territories. The words hit Clara like physical blows. Slade had found Charles Whitman's lies and believed them, just as everyone in Boston had. Once again, she was trapped by accusations she couldn't prove false. But this time, she wasn't alone. Ezra stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the mounted men. His rifle was still pointed at the ground, but his message was clear. "I don't care what papers you're waving around," Ezra said. "This is my land, and she's under my protection." Slade's smile widened, showing those gold teeth that caught the last rays of sunlight. "Protection won't help her when the federal marshals come calling. And they will come, McKinnon. I've already sent word to Denver about your little fugitive." Clara felt the walls closing in around her once again. Just when she had begun to hope for a peaceful life, the past had reached out with bloody claws to drag her back into nightmare. But as she looked at Ezra's determined stance, at the way he was willing to face down 3 armed men to defend her, Clara realized something had changed. She was no longer the helpless girl who had run from Boston in shame and terror. She was ready to fight back. Act V. The blizzard struck 3 days before Christmas, turning the Nevada mountains into a white prison that trapped Clara and Ezra together in the ranch house. Snow piled against the windows like ghostly fingers trying to claw their way inside, and the wind howled through the canyon with voices that sounded almost human. Clara stood at the kitchen stove, stirring a pot of beans that would have to last them another week if the storm didn't break soon. Their supplies were running dangerously low, only enough flour for 2 more days of bread, and the last of the salt pork hanging in the cold cellar. But food wasn't their biggest worry. "Storm's getting worse," Ezra said, shaking snow from his coat as he came in from checking the animals. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows, and his face was red with cold. "Lost 3 more cattle overnight. Found them frozen solid against the north fence." Clara's heart sank. Each dead cow represented money they couldn't afford to lose, especially with the barn still half rebuilt from Slade's fire. Winter was proving to be their cruelest enemy yet, worse than any human threat they had faced. But it wasn't the storm outside that frightened Clara most, it was the storm brewing inside the cabin. For 2 weeks, ever since Slade's visit, she and Ezra had been dancing around the truth like wolves circling a campfire. She knew he was waiting for her to explain the accusations Slade had made. He knew she was hiding something that could destroy them both. The silence between them had grown thick as winter honey, sweet on the surface but impossible to swallow. Every shared meal, every evening by the fire, every moment of ordinary life was shadowed by unspoken questions and fears neither dared to voice. "Coffee's ready," Clara said, pouring the bitter brew into 2 tin cups. They had run out of real coffee days ago, but roasted acorns made a fair substitute if you didn't think too hard about what you were drinking. Ezra warmed his hands around the hot cup, studying Clara's face in the firelight. She had changed during their months together, grown stronger, more confident, more beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with fancy clothes or powder and paint. But shadows still lurked in her eyes, secrets that built walls between them higher than any blizzard could pile snow. "Clara," he began, then stopped. How could he ask her to trust him with her past when he hadn't shared his own? How could he demand honesty while hiding the letter that had arrived just before the storm? The letter with official seals and federal stamps that waited unopened in his desk drawer. A violent gust of wind shook the cabin, rattling the windows and sending sparks up the chimney. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked and fell with a sound like thunder. The storm was reaching its peak, and they were running out of time in more ways than one. "We need to talk," Clara said suddenly, setting down her cup with hands that trembled slightly. "About Boston. About why I really came west." Ezra felt his stomach drop like a stone in deep water. Part of him wanted to stop her, to keep living in the comfortable lie they had built together. But lies were like ice on a roof. Eventually they always came crashing down. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, though they both knew that wasn't true anymore. Clara walked to the window and stared out at the white chaos beyond the glass. Snow was falling so thick that she couldn't see the barn, only 20 yards away. The world had become a blank page, waiting for someone to write a new story on its surface. "My real name is Clara Brennan," she began, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I was engaged to marry Charles Whitman, son of one of Boston's most important bankers. Everyone thought I was the luckiest girl in the city. She paused, gathering courage, like firewood, for a dying flame. Ezra waited, knowing that pushing her now would only drive her back into silence. Charles was handsome and charming and rich, Clara continued. But he was also a thief. He had been stealing money from his father's bank for months, taking it from accounts belonging to working families who trusted the Whitman name. When I discovered what he was doing, I threatened to expose him. The wind picked up again, screaming around the cabin like all the ghosts of winter. Clara pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window. He turned everything around on me, she whispered. Claimed I was the one stealing money, that I had seduced him into helping me. His father believed him, of course. So did the police. So did everyone who mattered in Boston society. Ezra felt anger burning in his chest like swallowed fire. He had seen enough of the world to know how easily powerful men could destroy the innocent, especially women who dared to stand up to them. Clara's crime hadn't been theft, it had been telling the truth when lies were more convenient. My father and I ran, Clara said, turning away from the window to face him. We came west, hoping to start over, but Papa died before we could build a new life. That's when Slade's accusations became dangerous again. If federal marshals come looking for me, they'll drag me back to Boston to face charges I can't prove false. The confession hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Ezra saw the fear in Clara's eyes, the way she was already bracing herself for his rejection. She expected him to throw her out into the storm, to wash his hands of her troubles like everyone else had done. Instead, he stood up and walked to his desk. His fingers found the unopened letter buried beneath bills and ranch papers. The federal seal seemed to burn his fingertips as he carried it back to the firelight. This came the day before the storm hit, he said, holding out the official envelope. I haven't opened it yet, but I think we both know what it says. Clara stared at the letter like it was a coiled rattlesnake, ready to strike. Her face went white as fresh snow, and she sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. They found me, she whispered. Maybe, Ezra said. Or maybe this is about something else entirely. But either way, we need to face it together. The word together made Clara look up sharply. You still want me here? Even knowing what I'm accused of? Ezra knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. I've watched you work for months, Clara. I've seen your character in 100 small ways. You're not a thief. You're one of the most honest people I've ever known. Tears ran down Clara's cheeks like melting snow. But what if they don't believe that? What if they take me away? Then we'll fight, Ezra said simply. We'll find a way to prove your innocence. But first, we need to see what that letter actually says. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Open it. Ezra's fingers worked at the official seal, breaking the red wax that held secrets inside. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, and firelight danced across words that would change everything. But before he could read the contents aloud, another sound cut through the storm, the distant ringing of a bell from the direction of town. Someone was riding through the blizzard, risking death to reach the ranch with urgent news. Clara and Ezra looked at each other, both thinking the same thought. The federal marshals had arrived in Calico Junction, and not even the worst storm in 20 years would stop them from collecting their prisoner. The ringing grew louder, coming closer through the white chaos outside. Soon they would know whether Clara's past had finally caught up with her, or whether the storm had brought a different kind of danger to their door. Either way, their peaceful winter evening was about to become something much more dangerous. Act V6. The man who stumbled through their door was more ice than human, his beard white with frost and his eyes wild with exhaustion. Dr. Samuel Hayes collapsed onto the cabin floor, gasping for breath that came out in great clouds of vapor. Federal marshals, he wheezed between desperate gulps of air. 3 of them rode into town this morning looking for a woman named Clara Brennan. Clara felt the world tilt sideways like a ship in a storm. After months of dreading this moment, her worst nightmare had finally arrived. The law had tracked her across half the continent, following a trail of lies that led straight to Charles Whitman's door. Ezra helped Dr. Hayes to a chair by the fire and pressed a cup of hot coffee into his frozen hands. "Why did you risk riding out in this storm to warn us?" "Because I know something about those marshals," Dr. Hayes said, his voice growing stronger as warmth returned to his body. "The leader is Marshal John Crawford. He's got a reputation for bringing in his prisoners dead as often as alive. Doesn't much care about innocence or guilt, just wants his reward money." Clara's blood turned to ice water. She had heard stories about bounty hunters who wore federal badges, men who cared more about collecting fees than serving justice. If Crawford was that kind of marshal, her chances of surviving a trip back to Boston were slim to none. "There's more," Dr. Hayes continued, glancing nervously between Clara and Ezra. "One of Crawford's men was asking specific questions about you, Miss Clara. New details about your father's death, about the auction, even about your work here at the ranch. Someone's been feeding them information. Slade." Clara didn't need to hear the name spoken to know who had betrayed her. The saloon owner had been planning this moment ever since Ezra outbid him at the auction, gathering evidence and building a case like a hunter setting snares. "How long before they reach the ranch?" Ezra asked. "Storm's slowing them down, but they're determined," Dr. Hayes replied. "I'd guess they'll be here by morning, maybe sooner if the wind dies down." Clara stared into the fire, watching flames dance like tiny devils celebrating her doom. She had perhaps 8 hours of freedom left before spending the rest of her life in prison, or worse. The unfairness of it all made her want to scream until her voice gave out. "We could run," she said quietly. "Take the horses and head deeper into the mountains. Hide until spring, then try to reach California." Ezra shook his head. "You'd die in this storm before you got 5 miles. Besides, running would just prove you're guilty in everyone's eyes." "But I can't prove I'm innocent." Clara's voice cracked with desperation. "Charles destroyed any evidence that might have helped me. It's his word against mine, and he's got all the power." Dr. Hayes leaned forward in his chair, firelight revealing a face creased with deep thought. "What if there was another way? What if we could turn the tables on these marshals?" "What do you mean?" Ezra asked. "I've been thinking about this ever since they rode into town," Dr. Hayes said. "Something doesn't feel right about their story. Real federal marshals don't usually travel in blizzards to arrest someone for embezzlement. They'd wait for better weather, especially when the accused is a woman with no history of violence." Clara felt a flicker of hope, small as a candle flame but growing brighter. "You think they might not be real marshals?" "It's possible, Dr. Present," Hayes said. "Easy enough to buy fake badges and papers if you know the right people. And Charles Whitman certainly has the money to hire private men to do his dirty work." The idea hit Clara like lightning. What if this wasn't an official arrest at all, but a kidnapping disguised as law enforcement? What if Charles was so desperate to silence her that he had hired thugs to drag her back to Boston outside the legal system? "Even if they're fake, they still have guns," Ezra pointed out. 3 armed men against the 3 of us doesn't sound like good odds. 4 of us, Dr. Hayes corrected. "I didn't ride out here just to warn you. I came to help fight." Clara looked at both men with amazement. Dr. Hayes barely knew her, yet he was willing to risk his life to defend her. Ezra had even more to lose: his ranch, his reputation, his freedom, but he never hesitated to stand by her side. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you both willing to do this for me?" Dr. Hayes smiled sadly. "I had a daughter once. She was accused of stealing medicine from my office medicine I had given her to help sick children whose families couldn't pay. The accusations destroyed her reputation and broke her spirit. She died of a fever the following winter, and I've always believed it was really heartbreak that killed her." Ezra's answer was simpler. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because you're worth fighting for." His words wrapped around Clara's heart like warm blankets on a cold night. For so long, she had felt worthless, damaged, unwanted. Now these 2 good men were ready to risk everything to prove her value, not just to the world, but to herself. "What's your plan?" she asked. Dr. Hayes grinned, and for a moment he looked years younger. "Well, first we need to examine that letter Ezra received. If it's really from federal authorities, we'll know these marshals are legitimate. If not..." Ezra picked up the unopened letter from where he had dropped it when Dr. Hayes arrived. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the official-looking document and held it up to the firelight. The silence stretched like a held breath as he read the contents. Clara watched his face for clues, searching for any sign of hope or despair. Finally, he looked up with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's not about you at all," he said slowly. "It's a notice that my brother died in Denver last month. Left me his share of a silver mine." Clara felt dizzy with relief and confusion. "Then the marshals aren't here officially?" "Doesn't look like it," Ezra said. "Which means Dr. Hayes is right. They're probably hired guns, pretending to be lawmen." "That gives us an advantage, Doctor," Hayes said. "Real marshals would have legal authority to search the ranch and arrest you. But kidnappers have to rely on force and intimidation. If we can expose their deception, we turn them from hunters into hunted," Clara finished, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. The wind no longer screamed around the cabin, and the snow was falling more gently. Soon the fake marshals would be able to make their way up the mountain trail, expecting to find a helpless woman ready to surrender to their authority. Instead, they would find a trap waiting for them, and 3 people who had decided to fight back against injustice, no matter what the cost might be. Clara felt something new growing inside her chest, something she hadn't experienced since the nightmare began in Boston. For the first time in months, she wasn't running from her problem. She was preparing to face them head-on, with friends who believed in her innocence standing by her side. The question now was whether their plan would be enough to defeat men who had money, weapons, and the advantage of surprise on their side. Gunfire exploded across the snowy valley as the 3 fake marshals rode into Ezra's carefully planned trap, their horses rearing and screaming in terror as bullets whistled over their heads from hidden positions around the ranch. "Drop your weapons!" Ezra shouted from behind the overturned wagon where he had taken cover. "You're surrounded!" The lead rider, a tall man with a silver badge pinned to his coat, wheeled his horse in a circle, trying to spot the shooters. "We're federal marshals on official business. Stand down or face charges of interfering with justice." But his voice carried the wrong accent for a government man, and his badge caught the morning sunlight in a way that revealed cheap metal instead of real silver. Dr. Hayes had been right. These were hired guns playing dress-up, not lawmen at all. Clara crouched behind a pile of firewood near the house, her heart hammering like a woodpecker against a tree. In her hands, she held Ezra's old hunting rifle, though she had never fired a gun in her life. The weight of it felt strange and dangerous, like holding a sleeping snake that might wake up at any moment. The plan had seemed simple when they discussed it by firelight. Let the fake marshals ride into the ranch yard, then surround them and force them to reveal who had hired them. But plans had a way of falling apart when bullets started flying, and Clara was beginning to understand why Ezra had looked so worried when dawn broke clear and cold. "There's only 3 of them," Dr. Hayes called from his position behind the barn. "Same as us. We can take them if we stick to the plan." The second rider, a stocky man with a black beard, swung his rifle toward the sound of the doctor's voice. His shot splintered wood from the barn wall, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. Dr. Hayes ducked lower, his face pale but determined. "Last warning," the leader shouted. "Send out Clara Brennan and nobody else gets hurt." Clara felt ice in her veins at hearing her real name spoken aloud. These men knew exactly who they were looking for, which meant Charles Whitman had indeed sent them. The question was whether they planned to take her back alive, or simply eliminate the threat she represented to his reputation. Ezra fired a warning shot that kicked up snow near the led horse's feet. "Show us your federal warrant. Prove you have legal authority here." "Don't need to prove nothing to you," the bearded man snarled. "We know she's here, and we're taking her back to Boston to face justice." But their hesitation told a different story. Real marshals would have produced their papers immediately, confident in their legal right to make arrests. These men were stalling because they had no legitimate authority to back up their demands. The third rider, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, seemed nervous about the whole situation. His horse danced sideways as gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, and he kept glancing at his companions, as if wondering whether this job was worth the money they were being paid. Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. Standing up from behind the woodpile, she stepped into clear view of the three men, though she kept the rifle pointed in their direction. "I'm Clara Brennan," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered yard. "If you want me, here I am. But first, you're going to answer some questions." The leader's eyes fixed on her, with the hungry look of a wolf spotting wounded prey. "There's no need for questions, miss. Just come along peaceful-like, and nobody gets hurt." "Whose money are you spending?" Clara demanded. "Who paid you to come after me?" The young rider shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "We're federal marshals, ma'am. We don't get paid by private parties." "Then show me your commission papers," Clara shot back. "Real marshals carry official documents signed by judges. Where are yours?" The silence that followed was more revealing than any confession. These men had badges and guns, but they lacked the one thing that would make their authority real, proper, legal papers. Dr. Hayes emerged from behind the barn, his own rifle trained on the bearded man. "I've seen real federal marshals, boys. They don't ride in winter storms for embezzlement cases. They don't threaten innocent ranchers. And they sure don't work for private citizens with grudges to settle." The leader's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "You're making a big mistake, old man. Interfering with federal business is a hanging offense." "So is impersonating federal officers," Ezra replied, moving closer with his rifle ready. "Which is what you three are doing. Question is, do you want to face those charges in a real court, or would you rather tell us who hired you and ride away quietly?" For a moment, the standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Clara could see the calculations running through each man's mind. Was the money worth risking their lives? Did they really want to start a shooting war over one woman's freedom? The young rider made the decision for all of them. "This ain't worth dying for," he said, lowering his weapon. "Lady, I don't know what you did back east, but it ain't worth getting killed over." "Shut up, Jimmy," the leader hissed. "We got a job to finish." But Jimmy was already turning his horse toward the trail that led back to town. "Find yourself another fool. I signed up to arrest a criminal, not fight a war." As Jimmy rode away, the balance of power shifted dramatically. 2 against 3 were much better odds, especially when one of the 2 remaining fake marshals was clearly having second thoughts about the whole enterprise. The bearded man looked at his leader uncertainly. "Maybe we should think about this, Crawford. These folks are ready to fight, and Jimmy's right, we ain't getting paid enough to die." Crawford, if that was his real name, seemed torn between greed and self-preservation. Clara could see him weighing his options, trying to decide whether to cut his losses or double down on a losing hand. "Charles Whitman's paying you," Clara said, pressing her advantage. "He hired you to bring me back to Boston, probably with orders to make sure I never arrive alive." But Charles made one big mistake. He underestimated what people will do to protect someone they care about. The truth of her words hit home like arrows finding their target. Crawford's face twitched with rage at having his employer named so directly, while the bearded man began to look genuinely frightened. "You don't know what you're talking about," Crawford said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know Charles is desperate," Clara continued. "I know he's stolen thousands of dollars from his father's bank, and he's running out of time before someone discovers the truth. I know he needs me dead or silenced to protect his precious reputation." Dr. Hayes stepped closer, his rifle never wavering from its target. "Here's what's going to happen, boys. You're going to drop your weapons, tell us exactly who hired you and how much you were paid, and then you're going to ride out of this territory and never come back." "And if we refuse?" Crawford asked. Ezra's smile was as cold as the winter wind. Then we tie you up and drag you to the real federal marshal in Carson City. Let you explain to him why you're carrying fake badges and threatening innocent citizens. The choice was simple: confess and leave, or face real justice for real crimes. Even Crawford could see that the game was over. But desperate men do desperate things, and Crawford was nothing if not desperate. His hand moved toward his gun with lightning speed, gambling everything on one final roll of the dice. The question was whether Clara and her friends would be fast enough to stop him before he turned their victory into tragedy. The wedding dress lay spread across Clara's bed like captured moonlight, its ivory silk shimmering in the morning sun that streamed through her bedroom window. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Crawford and his men, and the Nevada Territory had transformed from a place of fear into a land of hope. Clara traced the delicate lace trim with trembling fingers, hardly believing this day had finally arrived. Tomorrow she would marry Ezra McKinnon, not because she owed him a debt or needed his protection, but because she loved him with all her heart. The difference mattered more than she could ever explain. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Ezra or perhaps Mrs. Patterson from town, who had been helping with wedding preparations. Instead, a stranger stepped into the room, a well-dressed woman with graying hair and kind eyes that looked familiar in a way Clara couldn't quite place. The woman carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect, yet her smile held genuine warmth. "Miss Brennan, I'm Margaret Whitman. I believe you knew my son Charles." Clara's blood turned to ice. Charles Whitman's mother stood in her bedroom the day before her wedding, like a ghost from a nightmare she thought was finally over. Her first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. Her second was to call for help, but something in the older woman's manner made her hesitate. "Please, don't be frightened," Margaret said, closing the door softly behind her. "I haven't come to cause trouble. I've come to apologize." "Apologize?" Clara's voice came out as barely a whisper. Margaret moved closer, her eyes taking in the wedding dress and the simple but cheerful room. "For my son's lies, for the pain he caused you, for the fact that it took me far too long to discover the truth about what really happened in Boston." Clara sank into the chair by her window, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "You know the truth? I know Charles has been stealing from the bank for over 2 years," Margaret said, her voice heavy with shame. "I know he tried to blame you when you discovered his crimes. I know he hired those men to bring you back, or worse." The words hit Clara like physical blows. After months of wondering if anyone would ever believe her innocence, here was validation from the one person whose opinion mattered most, the mother of the man who had destroyed her life. "How did you find out?" Clara asked. Margaret pulled a leather folder from her traveling bag. "Charles made a mistake last month. He tried to steal from an account belonging to Judge Harrison, a man who pays very close attention to his finances. When the judge demanded an investigation, Charles panicked and tried to run." She opened the folder and spread papers across Clara's small table. Bank records, forged signatures, and accounting ledgers that told the story of systematic theft stretching back years. "He confessed everything when they caught him," Margaret continued, "including what he did to you. The false accusations, the bribes to officials, even hiring those men to track you down. He's in prison now, awaiting trial for embezzlement and conspiracy." Clara stared at the papers that proved her innocence, hardly daring to believe they were real. For so long, she had carried the weight of false accusations like chains around her soul. Now, those chains were finally broken. "Why did you come all this way to tell me?" Clara asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Because you were going to be my daughter-in-law once. Because I failed to see what kind of man my son really was. Because you deserved better than the pain he caused you." She reached into her bag again and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a string of pearls that caught the sunlight like captured raindrops. "These belonged to my mother, and her mother before that," Margaret said. "They were meant to be Charles's wedding gift to his bride. Since that will never happen now, I thought perhaps, if you would accept them. Clara's hands shook as she lifted the pearls from their velvet nest. They were more beautiful than anything she had ever owned. But their real value lay in what they represented: acceptance, forgiveness, and the acknowledgement of her worth. They're beautiful, Clara whispered. But I don't deserve. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, Margaret interrupted firmly. You showed courage when it would have been easier to stay silent. You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. That kind of character is rarer than pearls. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. Ezra was leading a group of men in setting up tables and benches for tomorrow's wedding celebration. The whole town had been invited, including many of the same people who had watched Clara sold at auction just 1 year ago. He's a good man, Margaret observed, watching Ezra direct the preparations with quiet authority. You can see it in how he treats people, how they respond to him. Charles could have learned something from a man like that. Clara nodded, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. He saved me in more ways than one, not just from Slade and Crawford, but from believing I was worthless. You were never worthless, Margaret said gently. You just needed to find people who could see your true value. As if summoned by their conversation, Ezra looked up and spotted them in the window. His face broke into the warm smile that never failed to make Clara's pulse quicken. He waved, and she waved back, the pearl necklace still draped across her fingers. I should let you prepare for your big day, Margaret said, standing to leave. But before I go, there's one more thing. She pulled out an official-looking document with legal seals and signatures. A full pardon from the governor of Massachusetts, clearing your name of all charges. Charles's confession made it possible. You are free to go anywhere, be anyone you choose. Clara took the pardon with hands that trembled with emotion. Freedom was a gift she had never expected to receive. Yet here it was offered not through her own efforts, but through the power of truth finally revealed. Thank you, she said, the words carrying the weight of months of fear and uncertainty. You don't know what this means to me. Margaret smiled and kissed Clara's forehead, like a mother blessing her child. I think I do. Now, wear those pearls tomorrow and be happy. You've earned it. After Margaret left, Clara sat alone with her wedding dress and her pearls and her official pardon. A year ago, she had been sold like property to pay a debt. Tomorrow, she would marry a man who saw her as a treasure beyond price. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had found her true worth not in the eyes of Boston society or in legal documents declaring her innocence, but in the love of good people who valued her for who she really was. Ezra had bid $300 for her freedom, but what they had built together was worth more than all the gold in California. As the sun set behind the Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Clara began to understand that some endings were really beginnings in disguise. Her story hadn't ended on an auction block in shame and fear. It had begun there, with a stranger's act of kindness that grew into something beautiful and lasting. Tomorrow, she would wear ivory, silk, and pearls. But today she was already clothed in something more precious than any earthly treasure. The knowledge that she was loved, valued, and finally, truly free. The girl who had been bought was about to become a woman who chose her own destiny. And that transformation was worth more than any price ever paid at auction.